Hi everybody, it's great to see you again. As always, Michael Wagner, one of the co-founders here at Omnia Family Wealth. I want to thank you again for sitting down with us as we spend a few minutes and consider the source. Joined today by a very special guest, Gary Mendell, who is a founder of HEI Hotels and Resorts and is also the founder and CEO of Shatterproof. Gary, so nice to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Michael, thank you.
Absolutely. So, Gary, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get started in the hotel industry, and really, what's that genesis?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the restaurant business. My dad owned a restaurant, and I used to love, from the time I was 6 or 7 years old, going to my dad's restaurant on weekends and summers, etc. And I ended up going to the hotel school at Cornell, and when I was on mid-20s, after working in the restaurant industry for a few years, my brother and I decided to start in our basement and see if we can build a hotel company that would own and operate hotels. And that was the start of it back in mid-1980s. And it worked. We started with one hotel, brought in multiple investors for our first one, second one, third one, etc. And starting in our sixth hotel, we moved into, after starting to build a track record, we moved into institutional funding and started to bring in large institutional funders to buy hotels with us, which led to then selling our business. I merged it in with Starwood Hotels and Resorts, and I was president of Starwood for a year and on their board, and retired for a few years, and then started all over again. And today we're one of the largest independent hotel operators in the country, the largest franchisee of Marriott's and Westin hotels in the country.
Wow. What an incredible growth story. So it starts out as a family business and you grow to this large corporation. I imagine one of your bigger challenges, like with any business, is attracting and retaining talent.
Correct.
So how do you find the right people and keep them?
It's a great question. Everyone has their own style and philosophy. Mine was to really go out and get the best talent I could possibly get with higher compensation levels to really get superstars in each of the areas. And in some cases go outside the hotel industry. So for our head of HR, I went outside the hotel industry to get a superstar. To run our hotels, I went after an individual who had been known as the leading operator in the country of full service hotels. For our general counsel, I obviously went outside the hotel industry. He's since been promoted after I left to run the business, when I left the business 10 years ago. Our head of acquisitions started out, he was at a mid-level of another organization, but grew in the business and is an absolute superstar in the investment side of the business. And I think it was a combination of higher compensation levels, treating people, bringing in people that knew their functions better than I did. My job was to bring everybody together more strategically, meet with our large donors who came in as institutional donors, which led to us raising our own discretionary funds. We ended up raising in 2004 a $300 million fund, 2 years later a $400 million fund, and then a $500 million fund. And it was all big name brand universities. Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth were our big institutional funders, their endowments. And the skill set I brought was, I'm not a hotel guy. Really? I speak the language of investors. I speak the language of Yale and Harvard and Dartmouth and Notre Dame as far as investment returns. And I'm going to bring everybody together. And I went out and recruited in best in class institutional expertise and talent.
So I think you touched on this when you talk about the role of a CEO, bringing the team together, coordinating. almost acting like a translator, it sounds like, from what you do to your investors. Could you dive a little deeper on like what you think makes a good to great CEO and how you separated yourself from other people doing what you do?
Sure. It's interesting. I received an award once and I was asked, what do you do so special? Similar to a question you just asked. And I said, nothing creative. Nothing. I'm not creative. It is blocking and tackling. Basic business practices 101. Big part of it is the 80-20 rule. There's so many things that you can do. How do you separate out the 100 that you want to do, that are really important, that people want to do, but are going to be less impactful to the real goals?
Right.
Pick the 5 things that really matter and get everyone focused on those 5 things with weekly reporting, bonuses, recognition on the 5 things that really drive the ultimate goals that you really care about. And I was really good at that, I would say. I was really good at really understanding what our goals were. You know, whenever at a certain level of position and higher, I would always interview the people as a final check. And I'd always ask, who's our customer? And 100% would say the guest at the front desk. And I would say, no. Our customer is our owner of the hotel, our investor. We have to live and breathe and build a culture to deliver the best possible return to our investors. That's why we're here. And of course, we have to take care of our guests to do that. But that'll show up in one of the 5 things, guest satisfaction scores. But it's not just revenue, it is our penetration of the existing revenue. And if we budget 103% penetration of that market, the market goes up and down, we have to deliver 103% penetration or greater. That's what you can control. And I think that's a skill set that I brought to it that really helped.
No, it's setting priorities, being a clear and effective communicator,
Right.
focusing on what you can control, which is a great skill for all aspects of life, I think.
Right.
I think those are all great and wonderful attributes.
But nothing creative.
Nothing creative, right? Nothing. It's not rocket science, as I
Right.
always say.
It's blocking and tackling.
getting it done.
Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. So how do you, we just got through this whole pandemic, and obviously it's been tumultuous for a number of industries.
Right.
But hotels and entertainment have been at the forefront of it.
Right.
What was it like, I guess, watching the business in that period, and how have things changed since the pandemic hit and moving forward?
No, great question. I have to be honest and preface this that I left the business day to day 10 years ago and promoted the top team to run it. And our general counsel, who became CFO, then was promoted to CEO and runs it day to day. So I was not that involved. As an owner of the business, I saw what went on, but they were implementing that, not me. And the big change in the first phase of the pandemic was working with owners to close many hotels temporarily, and the ones that stayed open, restructuring the cost structure. And as we did that, and the business started to come back, we had developed a new way to run hotels differently, where we took many positions that were outsourced to the hotels traditionally and brought them into shared cost structures with other hotels, and found a way to run hotels much more profitably on lower revenues. And a lot of that is now going to stick as revenues are coming back. A lot of that's going to stay in place. I mean, we developed, while I was there, and the team continued to do an even better job after I left, ways to run hotels, a full service 300 or 400 room Marriott or Sheraton or Hilton or Westin, more profitably than any company in the country. And we built the industry leading cost structure model. We built an industry, related to staffing. We built an industry leading cost structure model related to energy. We built an industry leading revenue model related to group rooms and revenue management. and all that stayed in place, but they were iterated and improved during this process. The team did a phenomenal job, and I can't take any credit with it. I can take credit of bringing in that team 20 years ago, but I can't take credit of the amazing work they did in the last 10 years, in the last couple of years.
Which leads to my next question.
Yes.
Succession planning is really difficult, and I think a lot of firms and people struggle with it. What was that process like for you? And do you have anything because it sounds like you have a great team in place, and they've really taken what we all stand on the shoulders of giants, right?
Right.
So they're standing on your shoulders, and they're continuing to evolve and progress with what you've started. So how did you pull that off?
Sure. It wasn't planned to retire 10 years ago from the business. But I had built, as we discussed a few minutes ago, a really strong team that all felt like partners, were partners in a percentage of the profits, acted like partners, and were superb at each of their individual positions. And then we had an incident in my family that led me to leaving the business 10 years ago, and it was an extremely easy transition. The team was so well run. Our systems were so automatic and built into the culture that it was a really extremely seamless transaction, like as easy as you can get. And the businesses continue to grow after I left.
Sounds like a really resilient organization, right? And
great
really,
team.
Regardless of the challenge, being able to rise to it and persevere.
Exactly. I mean, the business has continued to grow since I left. Superb team, and I give all the credit to them.
Sure. While you were there, obviously pre-pandemic and all of that, but you had a long career there. What were some of the challenges that you faced as you grew the business and you went from one chapter to the next, and how have you overcome those?
A great question. One challenge we had, the first challenge I would say we faced, let me back up. We started out as as a general partner, if you will.
Okay.
We would go find deals that we thought made sense in the early years when we started. We would then bring in individual investors to partner with us, and then we would bring in a management company to run the hotels. So we quickly learned that if our ultimate goal is to give the best return to investors, running the hotels would give us that extra knowledge base to really understand how to create the best return. So we decided to enter the second phase, not just owning the hotels, but also operating the hotels day to day as the management company. So that was the first hurdle. I wanted to really be the best at underwriting. And not just underwriting, but also making sure that once we owned a hotel, all everyone cared about was the best possible return to investors. So we started managing hotels. We grew into that business. The next challenge we faced was the recession, the big one right around 1990.
Okay.
And at that point, we only had 5 hotels, and they were all underwater. So we had to work with our partners and lenders to restructure them to get through that. But we did. I would say after that, we just excelled. I mean, we just became really good at what we were doing. We started to get a lot of interest from others to run their hotels, and I turned it all down. I said, we're only going to run hotels where we're a partner and we have an obligation to our owner to deliver the best returns. We're not going to do third-party management. And that turned out, it was just wonderful, because every Monday morning, it was just focused on, these are the hotels that we own and operate. One objective, highest return for our investors. How do we do it? So that worked out great. And then that business grew. We ended up merging with the predecessor to Starwood Hotels and Resorts. What became, we merged it in when they had about 80 hotels. At that point, we had about 20. And that was before Starwood owned the Westin brand, before they owned the Sheraton brand. And the year I was there on the board, that's the year that we bought Westin, or Starwood bought Westin, and Starwood bought the Sheraton ITT. It completely transformed the company. I worked there for a year, retired for a few years, and then got back and started our hotel company all over again. And that's when we transitioned from finding a hotel, aligning capital, to raising discretionary funds, because we had built such a track record in the returns we had given to our original investors. But I can't see any challenges. That was just all like fantastic.
Continued evolution.
Continued evolution. Yeah. There were no challenges. We just became the best in the country at doing what we're doing, delivering returns to owners.
Sure. If you could give your former self advice, or people who are still running a for-profit company or just getting started, what bits of advice might you offer yourself? Or
80-20 rule is number one. Mm-hmm. Every industry or business I come across, I now see it in what I'm doing now. The expertise that I think is so important is the 80-20 rule. There's so much to do in any business. How do you separate out the 100 things, and what are the most important, less than 10, key things that matter to your ultimate objective, which in a for-profit business, it's to your investors in that business. And in a nonprofit business, it's to your donors and the people you're serving in that nonprofit business.
Know who your stakeholders are.
Yeah.
And for the 80-20 rule, it's that 80% of your profits or your benefit is going to come from 20% of your effort, really.
Exactly. And it's really, we have a model that I referred to, an industry-leading model on call structure, and it's called the 90-10 model, which is 90% of your return comes from 10%. And I took that a step further and just built that into our culture.
It's really interesting. So Gary, tell me a bit about the story behind your founding of Shatterproof and why this is such an important mission for you.
Sure. Life was really going well for me, in the sense that I was raising my family in a small town in Connecticut. My hotel business was doing well. However, my older son, Brian, started to have an issue with alcohol and drugs when he was 15 or 16, became a problem when he was 17, which led to him going to 8 different treatment programs over 8 years. And he tried really hard to beat this disease. And I remember there were some hard times for sure, but he also attacked it with such enthusiasm. I remember visiting him one time at a treatment program in Florida. And I actually flew in really late the night before. And I got up really early the next morning, and I just wanted to watch him sleep. I hadn't seen him in like 4 months. And I walked into the place where he was staying and walked into his bedroom at like 7 o'clock in the morning. And I couldn't believe it. The light was on, and there he was on his bed flipping through his treatment book. And as I walked into the room, he looked up at me with that big smile of his. And he said, "Dad, don't worry. I got this. I'm going to beat it." But addiction always doesn't work that way. And several years later, after he was really starting to do well, I was woken up in the middle of the night and told that my son had just died. He was 25 years old, and he hadn't used a substance in 13 months. And equally tragic, Mike, it wasn't just addiction that took his own life. It was the feeling of shame he had every morning every morning when he opened his eyes, a feeling like an outcast, of all day long just feeling ashamed of who he was, that caused him to wake up that morning and research suicide notes, write a note of his own, light a candle, and take his own life, alone. And again, he hadn't used a substance in 13 months. Obviously, as a father, there's nothing worse. And in the weeks that followed, I really struggled with 2 questions. What could I have done differently as a father? What had I missed? And I couldn't change. It's back to the serenity prayer, accepting what you can't change, but changing what you can. So the first question was, what could I have done differently? And secondly, what could be done to spare other families of the tragedy that my family had suffered? So my hotel business was going well. I took what I thought was 3 months away from my business, and I traveled the country looking for answers to those two questions. I was in DC a lot, meeting with the federal agencies. I was traveled the country, meeting with researchers throughout the country. And I learned so much that I hadn't known. But there was one thing that rose to the top. I learned that our federal government, in the decades prior to my son passing away, had provided grants of tens of billions of dollars to researchers all across the country. And those researchers had successfully used that funding and created a wonderful body of knowledge, wonderful, that had proven without any doubt through randomly controlled trials, if our healthcare system and our families and our communities did A, B, and C, then significantly less of our loved ones would use alcohol or drugs and develop this disease. Proven through randomly controlled trials, no question, by large percentages. If our treatment programs for those who had developed this disease did X, Y, Z, then patients would do remarkably better, on par with patients being treated for diabetes or hypertension. Yet all this information was sitting in peer-reviewed medical journals. And the researchers all knew it, but families didn't know anything about it, and it wasn't being implemented in our nation. I just couldn't believe it. As a father, I was learning about all this. I was destroyed. Sure. Information that could have saved my son's life preventatively or through treatment. And not just my son, millions of others, hundreds of thousands of families not having to bury a child if this was simply implemented, or a loved one. But as a businessman, coming out of my career in business, I looked at it also as an opportunity. This answered my two questions. All we needed to do was not rocket science. Let NIH worry about new treatments, new science. What this nation needed, what our society needed, was an organization that would bring together millions of people, dozens of states, hundreds of companies, hundreds of other associations, and simply ensure that the research that was proven to work was implemented throughout our healthcare system, our families, and our communities. That's it. Block and tackle. And that's the answer to the question. And I remember sitting at a chair in my office as I came to this conclusion. And I remember looking up at the wall, and there was the last picture of Brian alive. It was 5 weeks before he died, where I had flown to see him to celebrate his 1 year of substance-free. And I remember we were riding bikes to dinner, and he stopped and he turned around, and I looked back, and there he was helping somebody on the street. And I had taken the picture. And it was like a signal from above. With Brian in my heart, we're going to go do this. And yes, I didn't have any experience in nonprofits or healthcare, but I didn't have much experience in my prior business, the hotel business. My skill set was bringing people together under a common mission and bringing in really strong talent with functional expertise. And I could see that I could do this. And with Brian in my heart, I decided to leave the hotel business. I still own it, but promoted the team to run it, and dedicate my life to this cause.
Gary, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
It sounds like you clearly identified a gap, and the question really is, why build your own organization versus fund existing organizations? Did those organizations not exist? Is there...
Great question. Great question. I looked at that. I looked at the impact that American Heart was having, American Cancer Society, Autism Speaks, Susan Komen, and others. And big organizations having large impact. And then I looked at what existed in this space. And there were hundreds of organizations, very small, having local impact, more in providing services, helping people to get into a treatment program in particular, maybe providing a scholarship or things like that. But I didn't see any organization that was creating systemic change, which is what we need. Because an organization in this space or any space is never going to be large enough to help everyone who needs help in that respective disease. But an organization can be a catalyst to bring society together, to create systemic change. So the society and the system will help hundreds of millions of people every year. The system will continue forever and get better and better and better. And that's what the vision I saw for this organization, to change the system, to change the treatment system that was broken, to change the prevention system that was broken. All this research existed, not being implemented. We can't implement it all, but we can bring partners together and be a catalyst to change the system. And I looked at all the nonprofits out there and I didn't find any that had the structure in place to be able to do that. And I looked specifically at several and I just didn't see it. And I got advice from federal agencies, with your skill set, create your own.
It's interesting because this battle with addiction can be a very personal and intimate issue. When we talk about systemic change, I wonder if you could take a moment to talk about the scale of the challenge when we're talking about battling addiction and the stigma.
Sure. Like I've mentioned earlier, a lot of it is focus. What are the things that can create the largest impact? Don't spread yourself too thin and make real systemic change in a few areas and then grow from there. So we identified 3 areas to really excel at and create systemic change. One is transforming the broken treatment system. 2 is ending the shame and stigma that prevents people from, I could talk for longer about that, but in so many ways from doing well. And then number 3, getting the education to families that they need to prevent this disease as best they can in their family, or if you have an issue, how to navigate the system. And we have become leaders in the country on all 3 of those.
Interesting. How many people are battling addiction statistically throughout the country? Like we all know somebody.
There's 40 million people in this country diagnosed with a substance use disorder, approximately. And approximately 200,000 of those are dying every year. And I shouldn't use the word dying every year because the year my son died, it was 120,000 people. Now it's 200,000. The big increase has been related to overdoses. Alcohol, deaths related to alcohol have been fairly stable stable in a horrible way at about 100,000 a year. And overdoses have grown significantly in the last decade.
What elements of the past chapter in your life running a for-profit company carried over into your nonprofit leadership? And then as a follow-on to that, what new skills have you had to develop in the nonprofit world that maybe you didn't need to use in the for-profit world?
Great question. Great questions. I would say all my skills from the for-profit world I've brought over to the nonprofit world. I can't tell you how many times, I can't count the number of times that I've done something like this, or I've made a presentation in front of hundreds of people and people come up to me afterwards in presentations where I've never mentioned my business background, or I've met with foundations where they've said to me, I have never heard someone speak from a nonprofit the way you do about, it's like you're running a for-profit business. To me, it's just my DNA. And so So what I brought to this is a for-profit basic blocking and tackling. Again, nothing, not rocket science. This is just basic. What are the key metrics? What are the few things that are going to have a largest impact on those metrics? Let's put aside everything else for now, and let's deliver and excel on those. And let's put systems in place that are industry leading, or even beyond that, industry game setting, and then continually improving those. And the recruiting really good talent within that structure. And I look at it like we have 4 business units at Shatterproof right now. We have a quality measurement system for addiction treatment. We have a business unit related to ending the shame and stigma related to this disease, those afflicted with it, their families, and the medications that treat it, and providing scientific information to families that is highly curated, very short, very engageable, that's all based on science. And then a 4th business unit related to public policy, changing laws and policies around the country, state by state, as well as federally, that transcends all 3 of those. 4, I don't call them set of business units. Each has a leader, each has measurable goals, this year, next year, the year after, best in class talent for each, and run it like a business. Additional skill sets I need to have brought to this that I didn't need in the for-profit world. It's a different world right now. I can't say it's different in the for-profit world versus a nonprofit versus for-profit, but it's different today than it was 10 years ago when I was in the for-profit world. You know, we're dealing with the question that any business is struggling with today: what needs to be in the office versus remote? How do you deal with the new generation of millennials who are in the workforce? I can't say that's different for-profit or non-for-profit. It's different this decade versus the decade before.
Sure. So within the last decade, we're just hopefully getting through this coronavirus pandemic. How is that, those 2 years, how has that affected the addiction numbers, but how has it also affected sort of our general understanding and awareness of mental health issues?
Great question. Not a great answer, but a great question. The use of alcohol has gone up dramatically in the last 2 years. Deaths don't happen right away, but there's a new funnel of people that have become addicted to alcohol that will tragically show up in statistics down the road. And the number of people overdosing has dramatically increased by almost 50% in the last 2 years, from like 70,000 to over 100,000. And that's related to what was really needed for the epidemic was the opposite of what is needed for those who have a substance use disorder addiction. What's needed for the epidemic was isolation, staying in your apartment, staying in your home, being alone, not being out, not socializing. Those are all the things that were necessary to control COVID, but those are things that are the opposite of what someone with a substance use disorder needed. And add on to that the anxiety that comes with, am I going to lose my job? Can I pay my rent? So it would, and hard to go get treatment. Disruption of the treatment system. So that has been a horrific impact of that. Now on the opposite side, what is really propelling the things that we're doing is a heightened interest in the public in this cause. You know, in a recent study that we just did, 82% of the public really is interested in news and the topic related to COVID, which is what you'd expect. Excuse me, 67% of the public is very interested in issues related to lung disease, flu. You'd expect that. But 62%, which is higher than historically, are very interested in mental health. 50% is very interested in addiction. those two numbers, mental health, which includes addiction in it,
Right.
because the two are so related to each other, and specifically addiction, are higher than have ever been historically. So there's a real interest in the public because they're hearing about 100,000 deaths, because they're hearing about how our youth is so much dealing with mental health issues that we need to get in there and help that preventatively, that it is propelling a lot more interest in what we're doing. And on top of that, what's helping, well, there's a lot of other reasons that's propelling our growth, but that's one of the bigger ones.
On the topic of public perceptions, how do you measure something as nebulous as stigma? And how do you combat something like that?
Absolutely. Great question. Lots of great questions.
Thank you.
There are many stigma campaigns that have been tried around the country. A lot of it is PSAs, a lot of it is billboards, and the measurement has only been how many hits, awareness, how many impressions.
Right.
Because I recognized early on the impact that stigma was having on this disease. Let me go back a second.
Sure.
I mentioned that my son was 25 years old when he died, had not used a substance in 13 months, but he took his own life. Why? I've never had to wonder, because he wrote about it in a suicide note. He wrote that, Dad, it's about not being treated like a human after I've tried so hard to get back to normal. And I thought about that sentence. And after we got Shatterproof up and running, that sentence haunted me. So in 2019, we spent a year, 12 months, studying all the research, not what I think or what I thought, but there's research that existed on how to reduce shame and stigma. And as I began that research, the first thing we looked at was the impact. Well, if you look at 9 drivers of the epidemic we're facing with addiction, we've identified 9. And we documented 7 of the 9 drivers that are either partially or fully driven by stigma. So think about an example, bring it to life. Take Johnny, who became addicted to alcohol or pot in his teens, not doing anything else that anybody did at that age, but for whatever reason, either Johnny had anxiety or depression and it connected better with him, or Johnny had it genetically predisposed, or just for whatever reason, Johnny became addicted. Or Johnny got hurt playing soccer and the doctor gave him 30 days of OxyContin and he became addicted. Well, is Johnny going to tell his parents? No, because Johnny is ashamed. He feels like a loser. Because 80% of a society, in a statistically significant survey, wants nothing to do with Johnny if they know he's addicted. Not as a friend, coworker, neighbor. So Johnny's not going to tell his parents. Let's say Johnny's parents find out, or Johnny's siblings or whatever, and Johnny's parents convince him to go to treatment. Can they find a provider? Well, maybe not. Because 25% of the providers in this country, 1/4 of primary care doctors, have said in a statistically significant survey that they're unwilling to treat people who are addicted because they don't want those people in their waiting room. It may hurt their practice. 1/4. Let's say they find a provider. Can they pay for it? Well, they may not be able to afford it because even though legally it's supposed to be paid for in the same way of other diseases, sometimes it's not. Let's say they get through that hurdle and the family can afford it. Can Johnny find a provider that's offering evidence-based care? Probably not. Statistically not, for sure. because most providers have not been taught in medical school, haven't had the proper training. Most providers are wonderful people,
Sure.
but they haven't had the proper training because it's not been viewed as a disease. Let's say Johnny gets through all those hurdles and then he's treated and he's back in society trying to live his life. But 80% of the public wants nothing to do with him. Now there's some Johnnies will say, I don't care what the public thinks. I know I'm a good person, and just deals with it.
Right.
But most Johnnies internalize it and they start to believe it. Like, I'm not worth it. I'm not worth. I shouldn't ask out my neighbor's daughter. I'm not worthy of a good job. And they feel worthless. And they hate themselves, as did my son. And it's not just my son, it's millions. So we studied for a year what will work and what didn't work. And we studied 11 social movements. How did our country change its view of HIV/AIDS? What worked? What didn't work? How did our country change its views of marriage equality? You couldn't even join the Boy Scouts 10 years ago if you were gay. Now you can run for president. What worked? They tried many things that didn't work, and they tried many things that did work. We studied 11 social movements. We researched over 100 published articles with real research in it. We interviewed over 50 experts for an hour and a half each who had gone through those movements. And we documented 6 key success factors of those movements that we thought would be applicable for this. And then we built a plan to do so for the stigma of addiction. And once that plan was published in June of 2020, we began to implement it. And we're having phenomenal results. So for example, we basically targeted in our plan 6 sectors of society with 3 action items.
Okay.
The 3 items are educating. The 3 action items are, it's educating, it's language change, and it's policy change.
Okay.
And those 3 action items for 6 sectors of our society. One of those sectors is the public living in communities throughout our country.
Okay.
And we did a pilot in the state of Pennsylvania. In 12 months, the program that we put together based on research, we did a statistically significant survey of the population before we started.
Okay.
And we did it 6 months again and 1 year again.
Okay.
And 6 months later at 1 year. After 1 year, we reached 4 million people in the state of Pennsylvania, about 30% of the population. And that 4 million people changed their views on 13 measures of stigma that we believe are the most important. We in the state agreed on the 13 things that were most important, and we changed their views, those 4 million people, by 15 points. Do you think people with this disease have an illness, or they're not trying hard enough? Moved approximately 15 points. Do you believe in the medications that treat someone addicted to opioids are effective? Moved almost 15 points. Do you believe that this medication that treats people addicted moved more than 15 points? On average, the 13 measures moved 15.1 points. So it's not about impressions.
Right.
We measure impressions as a leading indicator,
Sure.
but it's a way of delivering the message that has proven to work through other social movements that has worked. It worked so well, the state expanded or extended it for 2 more years with funding to us to do it. We instantly signed up a second state, the state of Kentucky. We're already in the 2nd month in Kentucky, and we're close to final approval on 3 other states. One of those 3 states is so large that if we're finally approved in those other 3 states in the next month or so, we'll be in 5 states representing 20% of the United States population. And that's just one program.
Yeah.
That is reducing the shame and stigma that exists in the public related to those with this disease, their families, and the medications that treat it. We're now started a month ago. We also got funding again because of the success we had there to pilot a different program to reduce the shame and stigma that healthcare professionals feel toward their patients.
Wow.
75% of the public doesn't think that someone with this disease has a disease. They think it's not trying hard enough. 55% of doctors don't think it's a disease. 50% of doctors in this country don't think that medications that treat it are effective. 50%. So that's the second. Again, the 80-20 rule. Let's focus on the public first. That's off and running and expanding.
Yep.
Now we're going to start a pilot with healthcare professionals. And then we'll go after the other 4 systems as we build those out. And we don't want to build out the healthcare professionals till we test it. We tested communities. It worked. Let's scale it.
Right.
We're now going to test healthcare professionals. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll test it again and we'll iterate it. Once we know that it works, then we'll scale it across the country. Then we'll go after the criminal justice system, media entertainment, government, large employers, or all employers, starting with the large employers.
It's fascinating to me because it is the pursuit of a noble mission in a nonprofit world using the tools and techniques from your for-profit life, performance indicators, iteration, and really doing what you can to move the ball forward on this issue. What can individuals do on a local level, on a family level, on an internal level to help in this battle against addiction? If we know people who are struggling, well, I'm sure at this point, people watching want to know what they can do to help. And I'd love to hear.
Absolutely. There's many ways. We have hundreds of thousands of people now part of our organization, dozens of states as partners, dozens of associations as partners, dozens of companies, more than dozens of companies that are partners with us. So how can people engage and help? In any way that feels good to them. So what are some of the ways? Sure. Obviously, donations really help. Our donation base continues to grow every year. That can help. Connecting us to others. You know, if someone cares about this cause, they may want to make a donation that feels good to them for what we're doing, and they're part of helping us and enabling us to do. And they may also want to have a coffee and dessert at their home and invite 10 friends and spread the concentric circle. That's one way. They may want to help as an advocate. We're continually changing policies in states. So some people are well connected to policymakers within their state. Sure. They may want to connect us to policymakers and advocate on our behalf. There are others who want to advocate at a grassroots level. There are, in every state, we have everybody in our database by zip code. If we're looking on a policy change in a state, we email everybody with that zip code and saying, we're trying to get this law passed in your state. We estimate that if we get it passed, we'll save this many lives per year. Can you hit this button and email your legislator? Would you be interested in coming to a public hearing and testifying with a story that will emotionally connect with legislators in your state? If we get a TV station that wants to do a story about addiction and wants a local resident to tell their story, would you be interested? And if you were for that or testifying at a public hearing, we'll train you and we'll get you ready for it. Would you be interested in sharing your story that we could issue as an op-ed in your state that can influence policy? We're doing community events around the country. We're bringing back our walks in 7 cities around the country this fall. And we want to expand that from 7 walks to 15 walks to 30 walks and engage people. Michael, there is nothing that I have been to that is as emotionally rewarding to me as being at a walk that we did pre-COVID, where you're looking out at an audience of 3,000 people. And you say to the audience, before the walk starts, you're on a podium, I look out at everybody and say, for those of you in recovery in this audience, look around. Look at all the people here that are here to say, I love you. I'm here to support you. Look at the logos here who are sponsors. JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Anthem, Aetna, Cigna, major corporations are here to say, we support the fact that you have a disease, we recognize it, and it's no different than someone with diabetes or hypertension, and we're here to support you. The tears start, I can look in the audience and I see the tears. And then people line up afterwards to come talk to me and hug me and cry and say, I've never been in an event like this before for the disease of addiction. And it's just, so anybody that wants to, in any local area you're in, work with others on a committee and form the nucleus of what can be a community event, whether it's one of our big walks or it's a local event that's smaller. Yeah. There's a variety of ways. And so if anyone watching this is interested, they can contact you, or they can go to the contact us on shatterproof.org. And there's a way you can just hit the contact button and reach out to us and just express roughly things you'd like to learn about, and we'll get back to you right away.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah.
Very touching and just personal, and I really appreciate the work. We all appreciate the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank all of you as well.